Hey everyone, I want to talk a little bit about your method section for your upcoming research paper. This is first and foremost, just remember your first draft, but let's talk about what goes in this section. So your method section is your most important aspect of your research paper because it provides the information by which validity of your study is ultimately going to be judged. So you as the author should make sure you provide clear and precise description of how your experiment or your project was done, as well as your rationale for specific experimental procedures that you chose. So in written form with as much explanation as possible, you want to be able to show that the experiment could be repeated by others to evaluate whether the results are reproducible. And two, the audience that's reading your research project or your research paper can judge whether the results and conclusions are actually valid. There are a few things that you want to make sure that you include in your method section, and that is subject information, ethical consideration, protocol design and preparation, as well as measurements and calculation. Now, historically, the method section was referred to as materials and methods, and often sometimes it still is considered this. Materials was referred to as what was examined, so humans, animals, tissue preparations, that kind of thing, and the various treatments used, so what type of therapy or intervention such as drugs, and then the instruments such as I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank here. Sorry, I drew a blank, such as like a gonometer. And the methods are referred to as how your subject or subjects were manipulated to answer the experimental question, and how measurements and calculations were made, and how the data was analyzed. So that included describing the materials used in the study, explaining how the materials were prepped and prepared, describing your research protocol, so exactly what you did, and then explaining how your measurements were made and what calculations were performed. And then generally you ended with stating what statistical tests were done to analyze your data. Secondly, your writing in this section should be very precise and very direct. Currently, as your first draft, because you haven't completed this yet, it's going to be written in future tense. But once you submit your final research paper, you will make sure that this is written in past tense. So make sure you focus on your sentence structures, and be descriptive, but don't add unimportant details. So I should say there is a art to writing a research paper, but that will come with practice. Right now we're just talking about the elements of the method section. So let's talk a little bit about subjects. Excuse me. Judging the external validity of a study involving, in your case, a human participant. Since we're focusing on a single subject design, I'm saying a human participant. Some of you may have a couple human participants. But for the most of you will only utilize one patient for your single subject design. But it requires it requires descriptive data about the basic demographic profile of your sample population. Now, in your case, this is just one person. So provide a basic demographic profile of the participant for your project. So that can include things like gender and racial composition, age, that kind of thing. The next aspect that you're going to include is your inclusion and exclusion criteria, because remember, this is generally in a large scale study looking at a large population. You should have inclusion and exclusion of how you picked your subjects for this study. Again, this is just a single subject project, so in most of your cases you may have picked your inclusion exclusion for the most part based on availability of participants. But if this was a full blown out study, you would want to make sure that your inclusion and exclusion is well defined before even starting the study, because that is how you're going to pick your sample population. So in this case, for your project, just give basic information of what you have decided what would be your inclusion criteria and exclusion criteria for picking your subject. So what criteria did you use to say this patient is who I'm going to use? And what elements were considered to be excluded what elements were considered for that patient to have to say, no, they cannot participate in this study? So did you look at certain age ranges as your inclusion and exclusion? If they weren't between 30 and 55, they couldn't participate in the study. That kind of thing. Again, it's not going to be extremely elaborate because this is, again, just a single subject project, but still provide that. Last thing is you're going to provide the rationale for enrolling, and it should be explicitly stated. The next section is going to be ethical considerations. Now, for this single subject project, you're probably just going to state whether verbal consent was received or an actual informed consent was received. On a larger scale, for a full research project, you would talk about the institution. Was it IRB approved? That kind of thing. So in your case, you won't have that because this is just a simple project and you're really practicing writing a research paper. But I want to make sure you do at least state that verbal consent was received or an informed consent form was used, the patient signed, that kind of thing. The next section that you're going to focus on is protocol design. Now, your research protocol, so I'm saying research protocol, but technically it's also your project protocol. It's a sequence of manipulations and measurement procedures that make up your experiment. So its description should follow the exact sequence of how the procedures were executed. So typically this would first involve a description of baseline conditions and any associated baseline measurements. So what was taken at baseline, what happened at baseline, that kind of thing. Give us the view of what baseline looked at before you actually started any therapy or any intervention. From there, you'll give the sequence of manipulations of your independent variable and the subsequent measurements of changes in dependent variable. So what were you testing? And what did the intervention consist of? How long did you do it? How many days did you do it? That kind of thing. Also for this case, because we are looking at single subject designs, tell us what kind of design did you use? Did you use an A-B design? Did you use an ABA withdrawal design? State that as well. Excuse me. The next section and the last section that we're going to focus on for now, because after this we would really add data analysis, but we'll get to that in a later portion of the class, is measurements and calculations. So you need to talk about what variables were measured in this study, and also describe what measurement instruments were used, or what outcome measures were used and why. Were they valid and reliable? Where did you get that literature from? Okay. For the different measurement instruments that you are utilizing, make sure you talk about the manufacturer model. I'm just going to use kinesio tape as an example because that's the first one on my brain. But talk about the manufacturer of the kinesio tape. What was the taping method that you used? How did you apply it? If you're using an actual instrument that requires calibration, what was the calibration procedure? Was the calibration current? And then you want to justify how your variables were measured. Okay? When you're writing your methods section, it's important to bear in mind that the rationale or assumptions on which some procedures are based are not always obvious. So make sure you can explain everything in detail, which is essentially why you're providing so much information. So always keep in mind that who your audience is. In this case, it's going to be myself, your professor, your classmates, and when you present additional faculty members. But it should be clear and it should be concise. The next part after this will be data analysis, which I will actually go into a different video. Right now, I just want you to get into the habit of practicing and writing these aspects of the method section. So again, you're going to describe your patient. You're going to say whether or not that you received verbal consent or an informed consent. You're going to provide in detail your protocol design and preparation, and then you're going to talk about the measurements and calculations. The length of this will vary, but you will at least for sure write 2 to 4 pages. If you have any questions, you're always welcome to reach out to me.